The Enlightenment, the intellectual movement of the 17th and 18th centuries which would form the philosophical basis for liberalism, the political system which has remained dominant in the West for the past 3 centuries. The ideas adopted from the Enlightenment, such as liberty, reason, democracy, and secularism, to this day largely form the basis of what the West considers to be good and just. A liberal today might make the claim that the values of the Enlightenment have endured the test of time. After all, the West is as wealthy, advanced, and safe as it has ever been. But for someone who looks behind all the economic prosperity and technological development to see a deeper societal sickness that threatens the West, one must consider the metaphysical basis of the society in which these problems developed. Because the conception of the individual, the state, and society handed down from the Enlightenment are largely used to legitimize the power structure under which the West is governed today. But if we are seeing a breakdown of our societal narrative, which I believe we are, questions will need to be answered. I've spent the last few months reading texts from famous Enlightenment thinkers and their defenders. I've spent some time reflecting upon these ideas and how they hold up today. And I am of the belief that the worldview advanced by the Enlightenment is incapable of answering the questions that will arise in our modern era. That is why I believe a real critique of the Enlightenment is needed, because I am convinced the Enlightenment is incapable of leading the West forward. This will be the first in another series of ongoing videos I'll be releasing on this channel titled Lies of the Enlightenment. Each video will focus on one idea from the Enlightenment and the various authors that advance this idea. I will attempt to hold these ideas up to scrutiny and ask, do they ring true about the nature of man, or are they false and preventing us from understanding the societal illness that afflicts the West today? And this first video will strike head-on at the biggest lie of the Enlightenment. Enlightenment itself. The idea that through reason and intellect, man can morally evolve as a creature. That there was this one point in the 18th century where something just clicked in the heads of men like Voltaire or Rousseau, as if they were struck by an epiphany from the secular ghost of liberalism, and they figured out how we can fundamentally improve the nature of man. And I believe that this is the ultimate falsehood of the Enlightenment. The idea that Western man ever became enlightened, or that he ever could. That today we fundamentally have advanced beyond our nature to achieve a higher ethical state. The entire narrative of the Enlightenment is that it led Europe past the so-called Dark Ages, and since then we've continued to make progress towards more freedom, more equality, more enlightenment. Progressivism is an ideology based on this very principle, progress. And the conception of modern Western society that it gives us is that we're advanced past our ancestors, and that we can overcome the various ills which have caused conflict in the past through reason and education. This is foolish, naive, and dangerous. But a liberal might say, look at the Dark Ages. They were pillaging and murdering each other back then. We aren't doing that anymore. Isn't that evidence that we're more advanced? It's true that we are less violent today than we were in the past, but that's because we're more advanced technologically, not ethically. Humans are creatures of nature, just like every other life form in existence. And their first and foremost purpose in life is to survive and to pass their genes onto a next generation. How difficult survival is will determine what measures must be taken in order to ensure that. In fact, I'd argue the purpose of civilization to begin with was to make survival easier. It was a lot easier to survive in a tribe than it was on your own, and it's much easier to survive in a settlement with industries than a nomadic tribe wandering the land. In the Middle Ages, it was common for one kingdom to invade another, pillage its land, and kill its people. But the reason they did this was not because they hadn't read Voltaire, or because they had a monarch and not a democracy. It's because survival for them was much more difficult than it is today. Upholding their kingdom was essential to survival, so if it meant going and destroying another, competing kingdom, they would do it, or else it would be done to them. Now that's not to glorify war, but to understand why it was necessary in the past. It's easy for us to look at the past and say they were barbarians, but in the modern world, we have no conception of how life actually was back then and what survival required. Thankfully today, we don't need to go off and kill each other for food. There are much more efficient survival strategies at our disposal, but to think that man has fundamentally changed is very dangerous. This first lie of the Enlightenment is cancerous for 2 major reasons. First of all, this narrative that we've become more enlightened over the past 3 centuries is a major contributor to Western guilt that we feel over our history. It suggests that the reason we were more violent in the past is because we lacked proper education, and that we just had liberalism back then, all this conflict would have been avoided. It also suggests that violence in the past was the result of a lack of ethics rather than the circumstances that existed back then. This is why evil is attributed to things like colonialism, slavery, the Crusades, or other such events in European history by our intelligentsia. That they were these evil, racist, religiously superstitious white supremacists who oppressed all other peoples for their own gain. The reality is that in order to maintain a civilization in past eras, it required things like hierarchies, social norms, obligations, industries, and ethnocentrism. And those needed to be enforced, sometimes by the sword. If they did not enforce their own dominance, a rival tribe, nation, or empire would come in and assert dominance over them. Today, left-wing intellectuals will say that this is institutional waifism, but it's not. It's just the reality of the game of civilization. People often say we shouldn't judge the past by today's morality, but this is also a mistake, because it plays into the narrative that humans have become more enlightened over time. Rather, we shouldn't judge the past by today's technology. When man's means of survival are more difficult, he will become more brutal in order to ensure he survives. If you took a group of 1,000 educated and well-off people out of a Western country today and put them on a deserted island with scarce resources, liberal values would not exist on this island. There would be no human rights. In only a short period of time, they would quickly revert to the means of survival required, and the entire facade of enlightenment would disappear. In that context, guilt over a past in which resources were much more scarce makes no sense whatsoever. Not to mention that this took place in every civilization, not just the West. Europe was just the most successful. It was also the least brutal in its rise to power. Just look at the histories of Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. They were full of slavery, war, genocide, and so on. Except they aren't made to feel guilty about this. Only Europeans are supposed to feel guilt over their history, and it's largely due to this narrative that we were unenlightened back then, but enlightened today. Secondly, the lie that the Enlightenment morally evolved the West makes us naive to the dangers our civilization faces. The Christian belief that man is a sinful creature, capable of committing the most unspeakable evils, was once held by the West. Christianity recognizes man's brutal nature and crafts a morality in order to curb his nature into something healthy. But Christian morality recognizes that man can never be a perfect being, and that if we ever lose sight of God and his moral framework, we're bound to fall into the chaos that human nature is capable of bringing about. Liberalism, on the other hand, sees man as an inherently good creature, and his nature can be changed through education. That we can become enlightened, and since the 18th century, we supposedly have. So catastrophes of the past could never happen again, as long as we teach everyone the values of liberalism. This leads us to believe that we don't need social norms, religion, morality, or hierarchy. It suggests that rather than these having served a civilizational purpose, they were just authoritarian and irrational means of control, which we've done away with through reason and science. And we disregard those who suggest that a lack of order could ever threaten the long-lasting health of our civilization as backward and unenlightened bigots who are scared of progress. This lie of the Enlightenment is what makes us believe that multiculturalism is a good idea. Sure, it ended in disaster in India, Yugoslavia, Rwanda, the Ottoman Empire, Zimbabwe, and many more, but we're enlightened now. We can overcome our ethnocentrism. We just need the right education. And the only reason this will fail is because of those racist bigots not committing to making multiculturalism work. It's what makes us believe that we just need to overthrow authoritarian regimes in the Middle East and expose them to the wonders of democracy. Once the people of these countries are shown the amazing, enlightening path of liberalism, they'll let go of their tribalism and religious superstitions and embrace freedom and equality. Yes, this idea that we have fundamentally progressed into more ethical creatures truly does blind the West to the dangers that human nature is capable of bringing about. The entire notion of enlightenment is born out of a civilization becoming too accustomed to wealth and security. When people reach all this comfort, but know nothing of the struggle that it took to get there, they look back and see the actions of those who got them there as unjust and barbaric. They see themselves as advanced beyond that, and they become more liberal, letting go of the societal structures that allowed them to get there. And as their comfort begins to deteriorate, they assure themselves that we are enlightened people. These social ills are nothing we can't fix without reason. We couldn't ever lose our sense of security. The truth is that humans are imperfect beings, and they can never be made perfect. Science, reason, education, or democracy can never change that. The best we can do is create a social order that takes into account human nature and guides man towards a healthy lifestyle. But we must always keep in mind that if order is not upheld, human nature will take its course once again. So no, the Enlightenment did not make us more enlightened, because we can never become more enlightened creatures. Sure, today we don't need to be as brutal as we used to survive, but don't think that if our security is ever threatened, we could never see the disasters of the past repeat themselves. Because we are today the same creatures we have always been. Brutal, ruthless, such is the nature of man.